Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Origins of the Long Story, a discussion on novels. The topic of discussion this week is novels, the long story format of telling stories in literature. As I already mentioned last week, that for starting last week, that we'll be deep diving into different genres of literature, and this week our topic is novels. So, on the agenda tonight or this evening is we'll be discussing on the origins of the novels, of how they originated, how they came into existence, and we'll also be talking about different approaches to novels. I mean, different approaches and how we go about in reading them, and how we absorb what they have to offer. And we'll also talk about novels and novelists that over the years have changed and altered the discourse of literature. Let me begin by introducing my panel for this evening. We have Abhinav Bhattacharya, a constant panelist joining me from Bangalore. And also joining Abhinav is a very special guest, Professor Nawal Nagi from University of Baruah.
Thank you for having me here, Akash. Hi.
Let's begin with a little bit of brief introduction of Nawal. Nawal, would you like to introduce?
Yes. Hello, everyone. My name is Nawal. I'm from Jorhat, Assam. I've completed my schooling from Commerce School, Jorhat, and that's where I got to know Akash. And we had been classmates for 14 years and friends for more than 15, I think now.
Yeah.
I pursued my graduation and post-graduation from Jesus and Mary College, Delhi University, and I'm currently employed as assistant professor in English in Assam Agricultural University.
Okay, so let's begin. I would like to begin this discussion with how novels originate, how and when, how this format of storytelling came into existence. Noel, would you like to share your views on the origins of the novel?
Yeah, okay. Before I start, I just want to say that I will be speaking specifically about the English novel, okay? Novels written in the English language.
Yeah.
All right. So, so 18th century was basically the time when English novels started gaining popularity suddenly. Whether English novels existed before that, that is highly contested, and I don't think I'll go into that. But I'll straight away just look at how the popularity increased all of a sudden in the 18th century. All right. So, in order to understand this, you have to, consider the social, economic, and political climate of England at that time. All right. So this was the time of the Industrial Revolution. So there were new manufacturing processes coming up. There was this growth of capital. The production was becoming very market oriented. Okay, new technologies, and this was the time when rural production also the market. Rural production also became market oriented, and this is what distribution of capital throughout the masses. So there was this wealth among the social classes of England of that time. This was also the time when the literacy rates of England massively. So if I look at the figures, in the 14th century, 80% English population couldn't spell their names. But by the 18th century, 62% population was literate. So there was this, new social class who was, and they were literate and they wanted to read. So that is how a market developed novel. And novel, became the most popular mode of expression, this new middle class or the bourgeois class. And this was also the time when, press proliferated throughout the land and paper became cheap. So these factors also influenced somehow.
Okay. Abhinav, your views on the origins of novels?
Yeah, I'll take a slightly broader perspective of the the entire global side of novels and how it originated. And it's very important. 18th century was very important in terms of the larger mass knowing, because English is a language everybody knows. It's a global language and everybody knows it. I'll just take a broader perspective on it. And arguably, I believe it was back in the 11th century, the first work of fiction in the form of a novel, The Tale of Genji. This was written by, again, Murasaki Shikibu, a lady. There are other claims, worldwide, as the essence and the nationalism, pours in. How difficult it is to, maneuver that. Everybody wants to say, okay, this came in first, but this is the most unbiased vote for the first novel, and that too had to come from a lady author who was quite prolific back in those days, in those terms. And interestingly, though, first paper making process was documented in China during the Eastern Han period, 25 to 20 AD. And the first novel came out almost 900 years later by their quintessential yet not very far off neighbor, Japan. So
Yeah.
that's my overall take. But yeah, I believe the first Indian novel, Raj Mohan's Wife, by Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay, came back in again the 18th century. And as Naval has highlighted, that is a year which was quite critical in terms of, even if you see from the cost of paper perspective, which Naval had mentioned. And 1864 was the year which it came out first. And but yes, sources today are as good as Wikipedia and English as a medium of expression over here. I wonder if we had the first university back in the wee days, you know, uh,
Yeah.
in uh, in the Soka era, basically Takshila. That's the first university. Why wasn't there proper documentation to account for some of the early days of literature back in the back during the Indus Valley civilization, building days, I would say. Or that's quite ironic, I feel, and something to ponder on, I think. And that's my take.
Thank you so much, Abhinav and Nawal, for your perspectives and your takes on the origins of novels. That brings us to the next question. Do you guys read novels, and how did you get introduced to this new world of novels and the long story format, the long storytelling format? Nawal, how did it begin for you?
Akash, I actually started reading novels when I was really, really young. I think I must be like around 8 or 9 years old, the small girl. So we used to have a lot of books at home. We still do,
Yeah.
and so the ones which I could read, storybooks, as you know, we used to call them,
Yeah.
they belong to my brother. So I used to just pick up these books and I started reading. I was just fascinated by those nice covers which had those colorful pictures, and then that's how I just started reading. So that's how it began. So when
Mm.
I grew a little, then I started buying novels for myself. I was really fond of Enid Blyton. I have completed the whole famous five series, Secret Seven series, and so many other adventure novels.
Yeah.
And another factor which I think really contributed to my this habit of reading was those weekly trips to the school library.
Yes.
The
Yes.
whole the whole class was taken to the school library, and we had to select a book, and then the following week we were supposed to return it. So we used
Yeah.
to have that 1 week of
Yeah.
that bracket. So this was the time when I read a lot of Nancy Drew series. Uh, I grew really fond of that. Then when I stepped into my teenage years, I started reading chick literature, starting with, of course, the very popular Princess Diaries, and
Yeah.
that's how it grew. That was how it started, basically, for me.
Okay, you just described your school life, the reading life, which I was also a part of. And you mentioned weekly trips to the library, and
Yes,
I'm not going to say this with immodesty of self-centered pompousness, but our school really had one of the best libraries ever.
I
And
agree, definitely.
yes, yes, and the fact that they used to take us every week, and they used to encourage us to borrow a
Mm,
book of ours and take it and read it
yes,
within the come back, return it,
yes.
and the cycle continues. So that's how many of us actually got into reading. I still remember I picked up my first Harry Potter book from the library, and that kind of introduced me to this whole other universe. And but gradually I came out of the world of fiction and I started borrowing novels, magazines instead, like India Today and
Okay.
Outlook, and that kind of shaped my life and career in a different way. And we'll talk about it some other time. But yes, that we those weekly trips to the library meant a lot back then. And in now when we think about it, we realize the importance. Abhinav, how did it begin for you?
Yeah. So yes, I do read a lot, and that's my poison. Been like this so far. The first novel I
Yeah,
read was definitely, Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island. Of course, the
yeah,
unedited version, without doubt. And then reread it a lot of times. Around, I would know the precise number. It's around 34 times, which I believe left a very deep aftertaste of, classics in me. But yes. It's a story which captured the brightest of minds back in the early years of the last decade, around 2014. A TV series popped up all of a sudden and captured my imagination. It was a brilliant take. It's called The Black Sails. It's about Captain Flint and his pirates, 20 years prior to R.L. Stevenson's classic novel Treasure Island, a prequel that too, which I've never seen it before. So, and after more than 130 odd years later. So it's completely mind blowing for me to have such a context in terms of cinema or even a TV series uh, around it. So overall, that's me. I think Stevenson's Treasure Island is something which always was there, and read a lot of other books as well, but that always kept my mind busy for a long time. Yeah,
okay, that's where it all began for you.
yeah, totally.
Okay. Okay. Moving on to the next question, I'd like to discuss about the difference in approach when you approach a novel for two different reasons. One is reading for the academic purpose, like for the English literature paper we used to answer in school, in college, in undergrads, and now you'll be able to shed some light on this. And versus the difference in approach when we read it for literary fulfillment, when we pick up a novel for ourselves in our free time. So how is the approach different when you read a novel to answer questions about it in an exam versus when you read it for literary fulfillment, when you read it for yourself, for pleasure reading? Professor Nawal.
Okay, so I think when you read a book for yourself, you basically do it for the pleasure that it gives you. You know,
Yeah,
you derive pleasure from the maybe the aesthetic sense of the book,
yeah,
the way the plot is structured, or maybe the style of expression. Maybe you're interested in the plot and the characters. That's why you want to read the book. The
yeah,
whole concept of this the page turner book. The book which you cannot keep down. So.
yeah,
But when you read it from an academic perspective, you have to really dive really, really deep into the book. You
yeah.
Oh,
Yes, Nawal, you were saying about the academic approach when you read a book for academic purpose.
Yes. So when you read a book from the academic purpose, you have to really, dive much deeper into the book. You have to
Yeah,
take into consideration a lot of things. You have to look at it from a lot of angles. Maybe
yeah,
you have to look for cues within the book, which might signal something about the writer or the society that he lived in.
yeah,
So there are many different interpretations which you make. You are bound to make actually.
yeah,
Few very basic of these are, like, for example, the biographical interpretation. So when you look at a book from that angle, you try to find a link between the book and the author's life. All right. uh, when then there is another sociological interpretation. So a sociological perspective would basically try to see reflections of the society within the book. Marxist interpretation is a kind of sociological interpretation. So in a Marxist interpretation, you basically take into consideration the economic and political angle of the book. You try to emphasize the ideology that the text is trying to propagate. All right, then there is this feminist criticism. You look at the gender politics of the text. Does the text endorse male produced assumptions? How does it treat the female characters of the story? So all of these are very basic levels of interpretations. There are more complex ones like deconstructive criticism, mythological criticism, psychoanalytic. But what I'm trying to say is that when you look at a text from so many different angles, you analyze it in so many different ways, you are bound to appreciate
Okay, Abhinav, would you like to present your take? The difference in approach when you're reading a novel for an academic purpose versus for literary fulfillment.
Well, Akashdeep, I would say both. I love the novel Miri Giori by Assamese author Rajnikanta Bordoloi. It's a tribal classic. If there is no such genre today, I would say we should create one such genre. And the book unveils some important aspects of then contemporary missing society. And a series of their customs and traditions. This is an example of my school days or ICSE book, which was quintessential in terms of literature, and never took a step back from imploding a student with the right literary concepts, especially without any specific bias on language. So that was quite key. And well, for literary fulfillment, it would be a completely different angle. After one is a published author, like I did publish my book recently, The Cauldron of Hope. The focus now is more towards history for me to be specific. But yes, just reading history doesn't really help you as an author to grow even. And if I pick, it doesn't really. Of course, I would say literature now, and even back then, had great authors to entertain the readers. Definitely, it has been a constant there. And if I pick a particular one, I would like to mention, Dhanpat Rai Srivastav's or his pen name, which is quite popular, Munshi Premchand. His book Godang is a stark communal drama. Themed around the socio-economic deprivation as well as exploitation of the village poor and their hardships. And I wonder if things had changed drastically since then for rural India. Even if you compare it with now, it hasn't changed much. So that was something which was written back in 1936, but then again translated to English back in 1957 by Jayaratan and Pilal as The Gift of a Cow. And 1968, again, the translation by Gordon C. Rodamel is now considered a classic in itself. It's a stark drama, and which is true even now today for rural India. So it's quite key in terms of which I didn't read it before I was published. So what I believe is like authors have to read. Not only authors, I think uh, even readers read a different set of books. But for me, this was key learning for me as an author. So that's my take.
Okay, thank you so much for your inputs on this. Moving on to the next question. This is like the most elaborate uh, question of this discussion. I would like to ask you about who, according to you, which novelists and novels, according to you, changed the discourse of literature? Professor Nawal, let's begin with you.
I actually have a number of writers to name for this. Okay, so I'll start with the ones who were the earliest, and then moving on to the more recent ones. Okay, so like I said, I'll just start from the two authors which sort of really to contributed to establish the novel as a genre. a popular genre amongst the masses. So, and these two writers were Jonathan Swift and Daniel Defoe. So I'm talking specifically about Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels and Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. Uh, it also becomes important to consider that 18th century, that was the time when England was, increasing its empire. It was colonizing other countries. So there were these people going on excursions. They were, discovering new lands, coming across new cultures, and colonizing them. All right. So if you see, both these books have this element of journey within them. So like in Gulliver's Travels, the protagonist makes a journey to four lands. And then again in Robinson Crusoe, the whole book is about a shipwrecked sailor, and this is also a book about colonization. So he lands on this island and he colonizes that island. He colonizes the native. So I think so these two writers really stand out for me, and I think they contributed immensely to establish novel as a genre, in the market. Then I think next I would like to name Mary Shelley and her Frankenstein. So Mary Shelley's Frankenstein for me is the pioneer of the science novel, the science fiction genre. So even though science fiction as a genre became, very popular much later with H.G. Wells, but in 1818, with the publication of this book, I think Mary Shelley sort of laid the groundwork for it. So most of you, I think, already know that this is a book about a scientist who creates a monster, and then the monster asks the scientist to create a mate for him, to which the scientist refuses, and then the monster, destroys his family and all that. So it's very interesting to sort of analyze the kind of themes Mary Shelley uses in this book. There is this whole theological theme of creation, the role of the creator. How do you see the creator? Then the use and abuse of science, very important. And also there's this problematic concept of motherhood in the text, because all the mothers in the text die really early on. So that is something, which you should pay attention to. So what I'm trying to say is that, Shelley uses these really unique themes, and, the way she has weaved a story out of this, I think that was pretty groundbreaking for that time. So, so that's why Mary Shelley totally stands out for me. Next, I want to name Lawrence Sterne and his The Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy. So if you happen to read this book, you will know that this book is one of a kind. You will, I think, not come across any text of this kind in any language. So that's what makes this book, so very different and unique. So in this book, Sterne basically tries to emphasize the irrationality of human thought. There is no linear narrative in the book, okay, most importantly. The book is in first person narrative. So in the first chapter of the book, the narrator starts to describe the day of his birth, the day when he was born. But he digresses so much to all kinds of different topics that he does not actually arrive to the point of his birth much later in the book. He does that around halfway, through the book. So that's what, there is no linear narrative. There are digressions. It's fragmented. So, by structuring the book in this way, Sterne basically tried to draw attention towards the illogical nature of human thinking. And he also, I think, experimented a lot for that time. So there is this blank page which comes in the middle of a book. There is a preface which comes in the middle of a book, which is very strange. Then there are figures throughout the book. So, all of these different things, they sort of drew emphasis on the fictionality of the text, how one has to always remember that you are reading a piece of text which is fiction. It is not real. So, all of this to sort of emphasize that again and again. So I think that's why Sterne really stands out for me in that way. Next, I think would be the very, very popular Charles Dickens.
Yeah.
So Dickens, yeah. So Dickens also has this unique reputation of never having gone out of popularity. His books have always remained popular. Even today, they are popular.
Yeah.
And Dickens was also a very sharp-eyed critic of the social flaws of England. So the
Yeah.
ease with which he portrayed society's woes and flaws, I think that that has been unparalleled. So if you look at any of his texts, Hard Times, David Copperfield, or Oliver Twist, all of these, they are criticizing some element of the society, some social flaw. Like Hard Times criticizes, it's set against the background of Industrial Revolution. So it's a critique of the social exploitation of factory workers. David Copperfield is a critique of, the predicament of the poor. Then Oliver Twist is about exploitation of children. So all of these books, they have some kind of critique of some social flaw or the other. So I think in that way, Charles Dickens becomes really important if we look at the history of novels. After that, coming to more recent times, I think it would be Virginia Woolf and her Mrs. Dalloway. So Virginia Woolf has been one of the finest practitioners of the stream of consciousness mode of narrative in literature. So if you look at her, Mrs. Dalloway, so this book is about this lady, Mrs. Dalloway, and it's about one day in the life of this lady, who is about to host a party that evening. And the whole narrative throughout the book, it just follows the terrain of thought of this lady. So Woolf is not interested in what goes on outside. She's not bothered about the plot. She's not bothered about how different characters are placed in the novel. But what she really tries to highlight is what goes on inside the character's mind. So even the themes that she works with in this novel, themes of isolation, depression, suicide, insanity. So all of these become very important, I think, if you consider the age in which she wrote. So 20th century was this time when she was writing, and I think she becomes a spokesperson for the time because this was the age which you had seen two world wars, So
Yeah.
all of these themes sort of resonated with the psyche of these people, what these people had been through. So Virginia Woolf remains a very important figure for me. Uh, Next is my personal favorite amongst all of these, and that is Narayan. So
Yeah.
Narayan, for me, he stands for Indianness,
Yeah.
like no other author does. Okay, so I think we all have a lot to credit him. He made Indian culture accessible to to the world outside through his novels. He was one of the first Indian novelists to be writing in English. And if you look at any of his books, he writes in a very simple language, very simple style. His plots are very simple, just ordinary people, middle class people, mundane issues. So nothing is extraordinary in his book, nothing is extravagant for that matter. But the delicate portrayal, the intricate portrayal which he gives to his characters is, I think, what makes them so extraordinary, makes him so extraordinary in that way. And last but not the least, I want to name Arundhati Roy and her God of Small Things. So Arundhati Roy, for me, she stands for a revolutionary voice in literature.
Yeah.
If you look at her God of Small Things, she has given a voice to the marginalized, the dispossessed,
Yeah.
people who have always been placed at the periphery, these people who never make it to the dominant discourse. So
Yeah.
in speaking for them, I think that's what makes her writing so fresh and unconventional. So that was it for me. These are the writers which really stand out for me, and I think they contributed a lot in shaping literature the way it is today.
I'm so glad that you mentioned about Arundhati Roy, and she still is a dominant voice. Especially, she's a very uh, strong voice of dissent currently. And if you look at the
Yeah.
kind of stuff she's written and spoken over the past, say, 6 months, you'll get to know. She spoke about all the atrocities that were committed over the marginalized, as you said, the people who are always
Hmm.
disconnected from the main discourse of, say, politics or economics or the socio-economic front. And even she's a very vocal critic of the government, of the current government that we are under. And she also took a lot of steps to make sure their voices were heard. And even during the migrant crisis that ensued during the first lockdown, she was always there, and she always spoke for in favor of the marginalized and people who live in the fringes, in the periphery. And I'm so glad you mentioned about her, because Arundhati Roy is a personal favorite of mine as well, and I really like. And okay, Abhinav, novels and novelists which change the discourse of literature, according to you.
Yeah. Arundhati Roy is my favorite as well, and especially Arkin Narayan. Narayan, I mean, basically, if you see his thought process, which as an author or a writer, which Naval has correctly mentioned, it's quite very difficult to write or think in those terms, in terms of mundane thoughts which you have come about.
Hmm.
Really shows his world building as an author. So again, I would like to overall mention three prominent authors to name here, basically, and their novels. The first one would be The Home and the World by Rabindranath Tagore, written back in 1916. The book illustrates the battle Tagore had with himself between the ideas of Western culture and revolution against the Western culture, which is quite key, I believe, in terms of world building back in those times which he was in, pre-independence era, I would say. And the second would be Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe, is another one which can never you can never ignore. Basically, the novel describes a tribal society uh, falling apart as a result of the arrival of Christian missionaries, basically. And yeah, isn't that the truth for the entire Africa, or even to West Africa to start with? And Achebe's, I think, book really resonated amongst a lot of people in terms of how colonization happened and how Christian missionaries took over during those facets of time. And it's again a period drama, but it was quite stark and very important. And again, and of course, had to mention Gabriel Garcia Marquez and his 100 Years of Solitude. The book was the author's first major work to dabble in magical realism, or even a blending of genres that would color his body of work for decades. And I think globally everybody has been through this in different languages, not only just English. And that was quite key, to be to be a author who's published in almost all global languages today. So all three had changed the larger mass around them in terms of social awareness and realism in their phase of their present world, in absolutely their phase. And this, I think, is quite essential in terms of world building as an author, to keep the work in the right spirits of literary culture and readership value creation, I believe. So that's my take.
Thank you so much for your views on that. Professor Nawal, I'd like to ask you a question related to literature and your profession. How has your approach towards literature changed ever since you started teaching? Like, how has it changed from a student to a professor? How has your approach and how has your outlook towards literature changed, if at all, if it has?
Okay. I don't think my approach or the outlook has changed. But since I was a student not very long back, so somewhere like I know how students think,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I'm conscious of that fact. So I really try to come to their level, and then try to convey something to them or make them understand something, because I know that on my level, maybe if I keep talking at just at my level, maybe they won't understand a lot of things, and also because they're not really students of literature. you know.
Yeah.
So I think there's that need on my part. And also, of course, like, it really takes me back to those college days when I was a student and I had these lovely professors. And
Yeah.
yeah, like I really miss that time, and I have very nice memories, and it takes me back to that time, and I try my best to deliver in a good way, in to the best of my potential, as much as I can to them. So, and I hope I succeed somewhat.
I trust you will. And okay, and Abhinav, you your debut novel was released a couple of months back, and you are a debutant novelist. How has your approach towards novels and literature changed as you moved from a reader to a novelist? Were there any changes, or do you still look at literature and novels in the same way that you used to do, say, 20 years back?
Yeah, I believe, Akash, basically the component of research has changed because as
Yeah,
a normal reader, without even writing a book, I was not that much into research. But nowadays, everything is research. And if you even consider the first book, The Cauldron of Hope, the research element came about where I was, deep diving into Alexander's life. So how did he die? So I had to do a lot of research around that. And the materials die down when it is stark,
yeah,
sorry, especially in the BC period. Basically it was 500
yeah.
BC when he died. So the amount of documentation around it also is quite minimal. Then you have to search around local excerpts around Greek mythology and Greek folklore, basically, or even Greek history. So that was, I think, research is key, and that's my take. I mean, research is the only thing which changes, and your reading also is more focused towards research and history.
Okay, that brings me to the last question of this discussion. I just want to know what you guys are reading currently. Professor Nawal, what are you currently reading?
Okay, I'm currently reading Anita Desai's Fire on the Mountain. So, this text is about this lady. She is the wife of the vice chancellor, of a retired vice chancellor. So, after his death, she goes to the hills of Kasoli to live all by herself, all her life. She's been so wound up in traditions, responsibilities, families, and all that. So now, she just wants to live for herself. But surprisingly and really unexpectedly, she is also entrusted with the responsibility of a great grandchild, something which she had not been expecting. So how she responds to that, and how these two, come to develop a bond, is what the story is about. And interestingly, the story also explores really uh, important issues like the Indian patriarchy, failed marriages, women suffering because of that, the predicament of women in these situations, women struggling for identity, to find their worth in life. So all of that, and it's a good read. And if you get time, I think you should put your hands on it and read it. You'll love it.
Definitely. I'm reading The Inheritance of Loss by Kiran Desai, Anita Desai's daughter. And so
Hmm.
that's another fantastic. I'm actually rereading it. I've read it a couple of times throughout my school life. Now I'm revisiting it again. Abhinav, I give you the last word for this discussion.
Oh, Akash, this week I'm stuck to this one.
Okay.
It's Omnibus Part Two. So Jim Corbett being a quintessential, I shouldn't call him a hunter. He was a conservationist as well,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
man eaters are something else. And as per law, man eaters are something which the even every district has a deputy commissioner, right? Always, it's a thing around man eaters that anybody with a licensed gun can actually take down a man-eating tiger or a leopard. So during those uh, quintessential rural days back in India, there were a lot of issues around that. So especially in the Kumaon region, so his man-eaters of Kumaon was something was I believe it was really stark. And some of the cases, I think one of the cases when he was hunting this leopard, a man-eating leopard, for 14 years he had to be on his trail. So you can imagine the patience. So
Yeah.
it's the man-eating leopard of Rudraprayag, which is quite key, I believe, as a tale to be on a trail. So that's perfect, and gives a lot of essence around how you do a lot of trails today, even from a ecology and conservation perspective. He had
Yeah.
he had a different take on it. Even while he was shooting a man-eating tiger, he didn't really he didn't disturb the nature in terms of there was a nest of a bird which he was literally brushed across, so that he had with he was holding an egg just to save nature there, and also making sure the actual human race also continues, because this man-eating tiger has killed a lot of innocents as well. So it was quite interesting take, though, in terms of that. That's my week for this week. And thanks a lot for, both of you for this really intriguing session. And you can stay safe and take care.
Okay. That brings me to the end of this discussion. Thank you so much, Abhinav and Professor Nawal, for joining me this week. And
It was a
I'd like
lovely
to
session, Akash. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
thank you, Abhinav,
Thanks.
and to all our viewers. Stay home, stay safe. Goodbye.
Take care.
Bye
Bye.
bye.